Good morning. It's really an honor to be here, and it's always a privilege to be able to share a message with you. And you're going to get a good dose of the Moors today, class, and now worship, and now tonight. So I apologize for that, but I know I can speak for my son, and that we're honored to be asked and to be involved in this process. I want to talk about this morning a place that came up in conversation in class, and Luke in his class talked about and brought up for discussion this place called Mount Moriah. And this place holds a lot of significance. In fact, if you were to say what the most holy mountain is in the world, in the religious world, they would say it's this place. But you may not know all of what took place at this site and its meaning and what the connections are for us in our lives. I want to just show you real quickly a little quick outline just to give you an idea of where we're at in the timeline. But in the time of Abraham, Mount Moriah and the location of what we now know as Jerusalem existed as a city called Salem. And that goes back all the way to the time of Abraham, during the time in which the Canaanites lived in Israel. The Canaanites were, of course, the son of Ham, and Melchizedek, who we'll talk about. Melchizedek was a priest of Yahweh, but he had no genealogy that we know of, but he was most certainly Canaanite. So he had retained the ways of his forefathers, going all the way back to Noah and his descendants. And then, of course, you move forward to the time of Moses. Moses was born about 1550 BC. And then, of course, the time of the United Kingdom, the time around David, and we're going to talk about Mount Moriah and the time of David. And then, of course, moving forward to the events that take place in the first century in and around this area in the time of Jesus. So you have kind of a timeline in which we see, of course, this place called Mount Moriah. So we start off with Genesis chapter 14 when Abraham confronts this man named Melchizedek. Now, in the Hebrew, Melech, if we break this word down, Melech means king, and Zedek is a term that's most likely translated into righteousness. So Melchizedek is this man who is referred to the New Testament many times in reference to Jesus himself, is this king of a place called Salem. So when Abraham is here at this site, he's going to be back at this site in a few chapters. We don't sometimes make this connection, but we see, of course, that Melchizedek was the priest of El Elyon, the God Most High, it references. And it says this in verses 18 through 20, that Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. That is, again, El Elyon. And he blessed Abraham. So we have this confrontation that takes place at Salem. And where is Salem? Well, Salem is right here where you see the Temple Mount today. This is a modern-day aerial picture of Jerusalem. And if you want to know where Abraham met Melchizedek, going all the way back to Genesis 14, it's right where you see that gold dome. And so you've seen that gold dome a lot, and you probably have seen it a lot in the media because there's bombs being lofted across the border into this area. But this is where all of this took place. So when you look at a topographical map, you see, of course, the high area, among the highest peaks is Mount Zion, and then you have this ridge that runs between Mount Zion and the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is this area here, which I'll show you in a minute. And running between Mount Moriah and the Mount of Olives is the Kidron Valley. And the Kidron, as you move eastward, connects right here with the Hinnom Valley. And when you look at this topographical map, as some of you who have been here, it's very obvious when you stand on the Mount of Olives and you look down, you're looking down on this ridge and of course the peak of that ridge is Mount Moriah. So in Genesis chapter 14, Abraham enters this area. He's going to be back at this area in just a few short chapters. But what you see here is the name Salem. And when you think of the name Jerusalem, you should probably think about Salem, because Salem is in the name that would become, that this area would be known for later, and that's, of course, Jerusalem. And, of course, this is the name of God whose worship was centered in the city. The full name of this God was the God Most High that we looked at earlier. But when you look at these events and you think of, well, what did Salem look like? Well, Salem sat right here. Now, just to give you an idea where we were just a second ago, this is Zion. This is Mount Moriah right here. And Salem was in this ridge that now is known as the Ophel, the Ophel Ridge. Mount of Olives here. So Salem was this small town that was in a very fortified area. But this mountain, this area, was very important. It was very important. It was the place where God had one of his early priests that existed during the time of Abraham. And you see, of course, Melchizedek, this name being, again, the king of righteousness. He was the priest of the God Most High. And, of course, we see in the name Salem, the name Jerusalem, that comes about later. And, of course, he's one of several people who are not Israelites. He was Canaanite, most likely, who was a priest of God. And remember, there's another priest of God, Yahweh, that was not Jewish. And you might remember his name. His name was Jethro. Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, who was a priest of Midian. So we see these priests that really are remnants of going all the way back to Abraham and his sons that lived after the flood. And then, of course, in Hebrews, we see a lot of Melchizedek popping back up. And the purpose of this lesson is not necessarily to review Melchizedek. We're looking at the significance of the site. But this was a place going all the way back to the time of Melchizedek where God was worshipped, and it was an important site to God. This is where Abraham pays tithes there. And then later, just in a few short chapters, we see another event taking place. And we see, of course, God directing Abraham back to this place, the same spot, in Genesis chapter 22. This is the offering of Isaac. And when you look at verses 19 through 14, it says this. It says, take your son, your only son. And if you see Isaac as being representative of Jesus in this subcontext, you're catching the point of this. Isaac is a type of Jesus here, being the only son who's going to be sacrificed. He says, take your only son and go to the where? To the region of Moriah. There he built an altar, but the angel of the Lord called out to him, do not lay a hand on the boy. Abraham looked up, saw a ram, and of course, what do we see here? We see God supplying a sacrifice here at this spot in the form of a ram. Remember where the scripture says that the ram was tangled, he was tangled up in the thorns. So you see images of thorns, of sacrifice, God's only son, the only son of Abraham. You see all of these beautiful images pointing to Jesus. And so, again, you see this beautiful picture of what happens here. Now, where was Abraham when Genesis 22 happens? Abraham is in Beersheba. Beersheba is in the south, and it's about maybe 50 miles or 80 kilometers. It's about a 3-day walk. And notice that when you go up this area here, you're going through Hebron. Hebron is important because it's the first capital of David. David's going to reign in Hebron for this first 7 years. He's going to go through this area, and he's going to go right back to the place where he had met Melchizedek. Now, in chapter 22, we don't catch a glimpse of Melchizedek again. But most certainly, where this event takes place, the ancient city of Salem was probably certainly still there. Again, another image of just the high ridge of mountains here. This central ridge of Israel is where all of the major cities are. You see, of course, Hebron in the south, Jerusalem, and as you go up, you come to a city called Shechem, and all of these cities, of course, exist right along this ridge, and the ridge turns into a mountain range that kind of veers to the west called Mount Carmel, another important site as well. So, what's important about this site? Well, this is a site that from early on, it's a site where God connected with his people. And it was a very important site. And so you see it being an important site going all the way back to Melchizedek. You see it being an important site where God connects with his people and where he connects with Abraham, where this sacrifice takes place. And again, that takes place right here. This is where Mount Moriah was, or is. And then, of course, we fast forward to the time of Joshua. And we have this group of people, this group of Canaanites, again, still Canaanites, that are occupying this area of Mount Moriah, and they're called the Jebusites. And we see reference in Judges chapter 1, verse 8, to the men of Judah attacking Jerusalem, and they take it, they put the city to flame, and sword and set it on fire, and all these things, but what happens afterwards? Well, they let the Canaanites go right back in. The Canaanites resume back at this place, and we know that because when David shows up, of course, David is going to have to drive the Jebusites back out of this place, and we see that later on. So in Judges chapter 1, verse 21, they couldn't keep the Canaanites out. They did not drive out the Jebusites. So Jerusalem during this time is again called Jebus, and it's important because after the Hebrews spent 400 years in Egypt, you have, of course, the Canaanite people in this area, the Jebusites, or what are also maybe the Amorites, the group of Canaanites that occupy this city. And then, of course, we see early on, we see a reference in the book of Judges to another Zadok. In fact, in Joshua chapter 10, verse 3, and then this is during the Judges period, this is before David, you see reference to this man named Adonai-Zedek, who was the king of the Jebusites. And boy, there's a lot to get into there, but again, you see the connection between this man and Melchizedek. And of course, Melchizedek was hundreds of years before him, but you see again this title that still exists, this man named Adonai-Zedek. And by the way, Adonai is the name we translate into Lord. And so you see this event taking place. But now you fast forward to the book of Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 21, we find the story that we studied in Bible class about Araunah. And who is Araunah? Araunah is a Jebusite. So after David goes in and removes the Jebusites, of course, the city of Jerusalem did not encompass the area of Mount Moriah. It was along this ridge, but it was not on there. But there remained this man named Araunah, or Ornan, the Jebusite, who had a threshing floor there. So we see not only the events of Melchizedek, Abraham twice, and then we have the Joshua confronting the Jebusites that are there in this same area. And then we see, of course, the purchase of this threshing floor that takes place. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, it says, "But I will buy them for the full price. I will not take for the Lord what is yours, nor offer burnt offerings that cost me nothing." So David paid Ornan 600 shekels of gold, which was a lot, and built an altar there. And where does he build the altar? He builds the altar exactly on the spot where Abraham built the altar for Isaac. And even before then, it's exactly the spot where Abraham meets Melchizedek. So Solomon builds the house of the Lord where sacrifices were going to be taking place in the temple for hundreds of years, and he builds it exactly on the same spot. 2 Chronicles 3:1. In fact, here's what you see. This is the city of David. So during the time of David, before he buys the threshing floor, this did not exist. This was Mount Moriah. This ridge is kind of referred to as Moriah, but Mount Moriah is here. So Solomon would build this temple right here on this threshing floor at that spot. And we see that happen. So after Joshua's death, of course, we are reminded that Judah could not dislodge the Jebusites. There's a whole lot of lessons we can learn from the fact that they could not remove these Canaanite peoples from their midst, which again is going to cause them a lot of trouble. But then we see the beautiful temple that Solomon's going to build, and that later Herod would rebuild right on top of the spot, and that now today sits a Muslim mosque right on that spot. The bottom line is, the point that I'm getting at is that this was a holy spot. It was a spot that had really a significant amount of significance to God's people. This is going to be the site where David's going to prepare for the temple to be built. It's going to be, of course, the site where he's going to remove these Jebusites. And what's interesting is that even after the children of Israel have been dispossessed of their land and they come back, in Ezra chapter 9, verse 1, this is the side point, there's still Jebusites there. It lists Jebusites among the people who they were intermarrying with. So you see, again, these people. So look at this. This was the city of David. This is what the city of David looked like when David takes over the site. This is likely, again, a smaller version of this is what Salem looked like during the time of Abraham. And then this is the site that Solomon would build this temple. This was the site where Abraham would sacrifice or attempt to sacrifice his son. This is another image of just showing you the topography here. This is the Kidron Valley, this ridge that goes up right up this way, the Central Valley, and of course Mount Moriah at the top there. And then you can see again the Ophel. The Ophel is the ridge between Mount Moriah and the city of David. Again, this is a more contemporary image that you see here of the old city of David. Now, this is a modern picture. The city of David, of course, is not encompassed by a wall anymore. These are more modern walls of the current city of Jerusalem, and then, of course, the Temple Mount there. So, when Jesus comes along, let's fast forward to Jesus. When Jesus comes along, of course, the temple is still there. Sacrifices are going on, but the temple had become a corrupt place. It was still the house of God, but even Jesus, when he talks to the Samaritan woman, he says in John chapter 4, he says, "The time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." Wow, what are you saying, Jesus? Jesus is for the first time introducing the idea that there's not going to be a need for a place like Mount Moriah. No longer will there be this place, the single place where God meets mankind. No longer will there be a need for an important holy site where sacrifices take place. And then in Matthew chapter 27, and Jesus cried out loud again in a voice, and he gave up his spirit. And what happens when Jesus is on the cross? You see this really important event take place. You see the curtain of the temple. And where was the temple? Where was the curtain? The curtain was at the site where Abraham attempts to sacrifice Isaac. It's right at this site, and that curtain is torn, and you see, of course, life and the Jewish system completely changed forever. And why is that important for us? Well, there are some people that like the idea and like maybe the idea that maybe Jesus' crucifixion took place on Mount Moriah. Wouldn't that make sense? Wouldn't that fit the pattern beautifully? But is that the case? Jesus wasn't crucified on Mount Moriah. I want you just quickly imagine the chaos that would exist now if Jesus were crucified where the temple was. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the political mess? I mean, there's a political mess that exists now because the Jews have to share the Temple Mount with the Muslims. But can you imagine that being the site where Jesus was crucified and the chaos that would exist with that being the holy site of Christendom? God was very wise in making the choice that Jesus would not be crucified on this place, where sacrifices, of course, took place. He would be sacrificed in a place outside the city walls, in the shadow of the Temple Mount, in a place where everyone that came into the city would have walked by, and it was a place for criminals. It was a place where crucifixions took place, where the most wretched people of the day would be hoisted up on a cross. This was not the rich part of town. This was outside of town. So you may ask yourself, well, why didn't God choose Mount Moriah, this holy place? Why didn't God choose for Jesus to be crucified there? Well, that's one of those things you'll have to ask him when you get there. But I have some ideas. God, through Jesus, the rendering of that temple curtain was setting up a new covenant, a new system that was to be separate and that was to be different and that was not to rely upon the sacrifices of animals, because no longer was there going to be a need for this holy mountain, this holy place. No longer was that going to be needed. In fact, you see in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16, it says, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit now dwells in your midst? Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19, in him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord, and in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. No longer is there a need for a temple, a mountain, a high place, because God now resides in you and us. And I love the fact that God chose a place, a humble place, for Jesus to have given his life up, to be the final sacrifice that would put an end permanently to the Jewish system. There's some people in Christendom who support the idea that God isn't finished with the sacrificial system and that there's going to be a new temple built physically on the Temple Mount where Mount Moriah was. Folks, if that's the case, Jesus had no reason to die. He had no reason to render that curtain. He had no reason to end the sacrificial system, because ultimately, 2 Corinthians, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him who had no sin to become or be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And what's so interesting is that Jesus' crucifixion, which is now marked by a really kind of a very busy, kind of a disorienting place called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's where this place was. Where Jesus was crucified was a place outside the city walls. It was an old quarry that had been filled in. And this quarry you can actually see remnants of when you go to Jerusalem today. This is the place around where Golgotha was. But the point is that when Jesus died, he puts an end to that system, and he puts an end because he became sin for us. He took on our penalty, because we never would deserve or would never find ourselves in a place to be deserving of being on the Temple Mount, where, again, the wealthy priests were, with the people that wore famous or very important robes, that held important positions. Jesus chose to take on the sins of the world in a place where criminals were put. And God's grace is extended to us through this blood. But there will be those who do not appropriate God's grace. You think, well, wait a second. God's grace is all-consuming. It's everywhere. It's for everyone. You're right. But there will be some of those that don't accept or that don't appropriate God's grace. Ultimately, what he calls us to do is, in order to be in us and to dwell in us richly, is we have to surrender ourselves and take ourselves out of the picture in order for him to live and thrive in us. The book of Hebrews, I think, says something that's very profound. The book of Hebrews chapter 10, it says, therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that what that faith brings. I want you to follow with me as I read this poem as we close. God's grace extends a call so sweet for weary hearts at his feet, not for the proud who seek their way, but for the humble who kneel and pray. His mercy flows a crimson stream, not for the strong who chase their dreams, but for the broken who bend, who yield in his love, they are healed. Christ emptied all, his life he gave, to rescue souls he longs to save. He calls us now to do the same, to lay down pride and bear his name. For only those who lose it all will rise anew at his gentle call. We are so blessed that none of us have to go to Israel to be pleasing to God. We don't have to climb a mountain. We don't have to go into a temple. All that he asks us to do is to surrender ourselves, empty ourselves like he did for us, and he will dwell in us richly. And we can have contact with his blood. He can live in us through his Spirit, and we can be saved, and we can be united with him in heaven. If you haven't emptied yourself fully, it may be that you need the prayers of this congregation. It may be that you need to really get down on your hands and knees tonight and ask God to help you empty yourself, because God will not be in you or work in you if your life is full of yourself. If you need the prayers of this congregation, if you need to have your sins washed away, now's the time. Let's come and let's stand and sing.